I started my 5th week on the road by catching the sunrise over the beach at Myrtle Beach State Park. But with over 100 miles to Charleston, I didn't have too much time to hang around, and I was on my way soon after. I was able to use Route 17 and 17 alternate for most of my ride. About a third of the way through, it took me through the Francis Marion National Forest, a large stretch of road that I largely had to myself. Unfortunately, my camera died at some point in the forest, but I made it out, and after a long day on the road, I found my way to Charleston. The next morning, I left the marina where my host lived and set out with the plan of getting as close to Savannah as comfortably possible. After a brief ride on a bike path that took me outside of the city, I got back on 17. 60 miles in, I stopped at the little town of Yemassee, South Carolina for an early dinner. I was surprised to find out that the Yemassee train station just across the street from me was at one time the last stop for Marine Corps recruits before reaching Parris Island. I finished up the day by slowly cycling the last 20 miles alongside I-95 into Ridgeland, South Carolina, where I found an announcer's box to spend the night. After spending a restful night in the air-conditioned tower, I set out to a foggy morning and rode the short 33 miles to Savannah. Instead of crossing the bridge on Route 17, I opted to use the free Savannah Bells ferry that brought me to the city. I had a few hours to kill, so I spent it walking around the city, stopping at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, Forsyth Park, and Leopold's Ice Cream. I finished the first day of my second month by cycling to where my host lived, a dozen miles outside the city of Savannah. The next morning, I continued south along Route 17. I broke the 80-mile day into a couple legs, stopping in Darien, Georgia for a pizza dinner, before setting out for the last 24 miles to Brunswick. Along the way, I biked past the smallest church in America and stopped in to take a quick look around. It was pretty small. I got caught in a few miles of rain shortly after leaving, but it quickly passed and I finished the relatively easy day, stopping first to pick up some supplies before finding a spot for the night. I got up on Friday and quickly packed my things while fending off swarms of gnats. I set out for a long day on Route 17 and eventually passed over into Florida. It was a hot and muggy day, but I made steady progress. I was 25 miles away from my destination when I got my first flat. After a brief inspection, I found that a tiny piece of glass had punctured the tire. I set about changing the inner tube, and a half hour later I was back on my way. The rest of the ride passed uneventfully, and I found my way to the tennis tournament that my hosts were at. We had a great buffet-style dinner at the courts before returning to their home for a relaxing evening. Saturday saw me continuing south to see my sister in Gainesville, a 65-mile ride away. The first half was rough, with a steady headwind, some modest hills, and my legs being tired from all the miles earlier in the week. I slowly made my way through the first 35 miles. After a stop for lunch, the second half went much smoother. The wind calmed down a bit, and before I knew it, I was off the highway and in Gainesville. Later that evening, my sister took me out to Midnight Cookies, a made-to-order cookie spot. Their cookies and cream flavor was delicious. Sunday was the first of 2 days that I was planning on taking off. That afternoon, we went out and I bought new tires for the bike, which was pretty exciting. Later that afternoon, they treated me to a really tasty dinner at a local Korean barbecue spot. I had a fun time trying all the different options. It was a relaxing Sunday and a great way to wrap up my 5th week on the road.